Good afternoon and welcome to Live with Lewis for July 8th, 2004. We're coming to you live today from St. Joseph, Missouri, just a short distance from the banks of the Missouri River, and we're going to talk a great deal more about St. Joe as we go through today's broadcast. But just want to get some of our business taken care of right up front today. Want to remind our viewers on the internet today that they can email us at lewisandclark@clayton.k12.mo.us. Once again, that's Lewis and Clark, LEWISANDCLARK, all spelled out, at Clayton, CLAYTON.K12.mo.us. And we look forward to taking those email questions from you later in today's broadcast. We want to start, as always, talking about what's happened since we saw you last. And when we last spoke with you, we were coming to you live from Fort Leavenworth, near Leavenworth, Kansas. And for several days, the expedition, as did the original one, was camped on the larboard side of the river, ascending on what is now the Kansas side of the river. And of course, we shared with you images from that area, as well as the Frontier Army Museum there at Leavenworth, and we were happy to bring those images to you last week. But we want to talk, as always, first of all, about the historical week in review. You may remember that at that time last week we talked about the fact that Lewis and Clark had identified some islands that they called the Islands of the Fields, or an area which in the middle of the 18th century had actually been inhabited by French settlers, and that there had been a French fortification near the area where the Fort Leavenworth is now located. And we talked about those islands there. The expedition, when it departed from that area, started to again note the change in topography. The hills that were running in parallel with the river became broken, high elevation, with prairies and plains starting to extend out between those high hills, but there were still a chain of high hills in the area. The current is very swift still in this particular area, and as we moved up from Leavenworth toward what is now Atchison, as the original expedition did, they started to pass some open areas, which they refer to as bayous, and slough areas where the water is starting to, as it was 200 years ago, was eking back into those low-lying areas, creating wetlands that provided a very fertile environment for, among other things, goslings, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. As we pass historically along that area, we come ultimately to the 4th of July 1804 Creek, which is located at present-day Atchison, Kansas. And Lewis and Clark, of course, recorded that, and that was a very noteworthy day for them, the 4th of July 200 years ago. They noted that creek there. They talk about starting the day with the blast of a cannon and passing by that creek, which they give the extremely long name 4th of July 1804 Creek, ultimately, which interestingly enough was changed in the early 20th century to White Clay Creek. And in 1996, when our first expedition passed by there, our first reenactment of this leg of the journey, we were actually involved with the city of Atchison in renaming that creek 4th of July 1804 Creek, so it bears that name again. Of course, the expedition then passed by that area. They talk about Lewis climbing a high hill to an elevated situation and a large mound he believed to be an Indian burial area, and from that area he was able to encounter old Kansas villages, move down to the Independence Creek area several miles above 4th of July Creek. And that's where they actually spent that campsite that evening. And while the original campsite, we believe we know roughly where it is somewhat removed from where the mouth of the from the mouth of the creek, because the river has changed. Some folks from the Corps of Engineers and others were down there commemorating that particular campsite, which they would have passed then. And Lewis and Clark both, Lewis is making mostly celestial observations at this point. Clark is doing most of the narrative journaling, but they're talking about the rich, fertile area that they're in. There's still an abundance of deer, although as we move into the area we're in right now, they talk about the deer population being more sparse. When they passed Atchison, what was to become Atchison 200 years ago, they talk about a lake, a large lake that was full of sunfish and teeming with goslings, and ultimately the name of that creek became Gosling Creek, as it was named by William Clark. They also passed by a large prairie in that area where Joseph Field was bit by a snake, and they actually gave that prairie the name Joe Field Snake Bit Prairie. Sometimes the names that were used for these places along the way were identifiers, so that as the captains would later work on their journals and on the maps, they would be able to marry up the adventures that they had, the experiences and the incidents that took place with the geographic location. So those names are oftentimes important as clues to them when they go back to do their journaling and to flesh those journals out later. We've passed by the same area as the original expedition did coming to this date. They passed by what is now Atchison, passed by what is now St. Joseph, Missouri, where we're broadcasting to you from today. In this area, there was already a tremendous amount of activity. Joseph Robidoux was the gentleman who was operating the American Fur Company trading post here, had been here quite a bit before Lewis and Clark, and had been trading furs down to St. Louis, had been interacting with the Sac and the Fox and other Native Americans that were in this area, bringing their pelts to market and trading with them. And Robidoux was a very creative and forward-thinking individual. We'll have a chance to talk a little bit about him later. I want to right now, and that brings us up actually to our current location. The expedition itself, we've moved back into St. Joe to bring you some interesting highlights of this community, but we, as the original expedition did on the timeline, have moved now to Nottoway Island, just above Ordway Creek. And those of you who are not familiar, Sergeant Ordway, of course, the top sergeant for the expedition, that creek just above what is now St. Joe, named for him. And then the expedition stopped at just below the Nottoway River near Nottoway Island, and that's where the boats are today, and we'll be able to show you some footage near the end of the show of the boats en route to that location. Right now we're going to take a look at what's happened to us over the past week or so since we came to you last from Leavenworth. One of the things that happened, of course, we came to you from Leavenworth. We talked about the Frontier Army Museum. We had a terrific time there with those folks, and we actually at that point started to encounter Native American members of the community. There were members there of the Prairie Band of the Shawnee Nation of Kansas, and the Kaw. And we were very proud to be able to participate in some ceremonies there in the Leavenworth area. And, of course, Leavenworth being a military community, we had a special time there with those folks in advent of the 4th of July as they prepared for their celebrations. Many of the young men and women from Fort Leavenworth getting ready to rotate overseas and to continue their service for the United States. And we were proud to serve there. We don't have a lot of footage from Leavenworth, but we are going to be moving now directly into the Atchison area. So we're going to go to that footage now and try to describe for you what you're seeing as we enter the Atchison area to celebrate the 4th of July during the Journey Forth ceremony, Journey Forth signature event ceremonies taking place over the last weekend. If we can go to that now, Jim. And here we are marching into Atchison. This is on the 3rd of July. Some of the festivities taking place the day before. This is a very relaxed environment here on this day. The men are extremely hot, and you see marching in the whites there, trying to keep the men cool on a very hot day, beautiful day. And we'll just let the audio go now.
Truly wonderful to see this sea of faces, and it means so much to Atchison.
We're here also for Independence Day, which we have the privilege of peacefully gathering here, but there are others who are standing in harm's way, and I think it's fitting that we take a few moments at some point today to stop and thank them.
To salute the celebration.
I'm not sure many of you have heard a beautiful flag song, and the Little Soldier drum group from the Prairie Band Potawatomi are going to treat you to one of the best I've ever heard.
commemorate, we recognize the fact that there were Native Americans here hundreds of years before Lewis and Clark came. And part of the story is to celebrate the nations who took care of this beautiful land and helped the Corps of Discovery figure their way through these wilds that were the Louisiana Purchase.
On one side is replicated a picture of the original keelboat built by our mentor, Glenn Bishop. On the other side is the original design of the Jefferson Peace Medal with the clasped hands, the crossed pipe and tomahawk, and the words peace and friendship. It's a medal that cannot be purchased. It can only be presented from the crew. Governor, on behalf of the Discovery Expedition and its peace and friendship, and hoping that I'm redeeming myself for my oversights this morning in Leavenworth.
Not a problem. Thank you very much.
And here we are making our way into Atchison for the ceremonial arrival for the signature event. Bringing the keelboat in under sail. We had been able to catch a little wind that day, and the pirogue's moving under oar power as we make our way in for the Journey Forth signature event celebration. And as always, the boats providing a tremendous attraction, really acting as the cursor for the entire Bicentennial. Of course, we were joined here by the Fife and Drum Corps as well, and this was a very nice docking area. Again, we've talked about this before, but the Bicentennial has been the real catalyst for a tremendous amount of riverfront development all along the Missouri River, making the river much more hospitable to boat traffic, and we hope that part of the legacy of this Bicentennial is that the Missouri River will again be a conduit for cultural exchange as people make their way up and down the river. It's the best way to enter a city. You really see the character of the community when you enter it this way. And as you can see, our numbers quite large for this event. Many of the men coming in for the weekend from different areas to join us to make this celebration a success for everyone involved. I would note also that on this morning, the 4th of July, we started the day with a cannon salute, as did the original expedition. And Dayton Duncan, well-known author and a screenwriter for Ken Burns documentary films and a publisher of his own books, his own right, and good friend of the Corps, joined us that morning to fire the cannon.
One of the most moving and patriotically enveloped towns and places that we saw or have seen since. And it is a great honor to be celebrating this 4th of July with you here again. And I hope that in 200 years they'll remember what we have to tell them today, and that is that on this 4th of July, it's a new day in this country. And 200 years from now, when we seamlessly move among our American brothers and sisters, black and white and red and yellow and otherwise, that we can't even hardly remember a day that when we did otherwise. So 200 years from now, let's remind each other of how far we've come and what happened here today, because what happened 200 years ago was just the beginning of this long journey that we're on, and it's a long way to go yet. Happy birthday, America.
And on the 4th of July, we were very excited to take possession of our new dog. Seaman's Bicentennial is his full name, and we're going to refer to him as Bison. And there you see him with Sue Auger there on the left. In the blue, Sue is the woman who is the breeder of both Seaman and of Bison. And Bison is going to be joining us on the trail on a regular basis here very shortly. We're very excited about that, and we thank Sue for all of her good offices to make this a reality and help to bring the story alive again. So we thank her for that, and we're looking forward to having Seaman back with us, or excuse me, Bison back with us in just a few short weeks after he completes his obedience training school, which I was informed that he went to his first class last night with my wife and that he pummeled all the other puppies there. So he's ready for the trail, evidently. We're looking forward to getting him back. We're very excited. We're going to be joined today by a couple of different folks from museums here in the St. Joe area. One of the reasons that we wanted to broadcast from St. Joe rather than on up where we've moved the boats is because St. Joe is a unique community in of its own right, formed in 1836, officially formed in 1836, although long inhabited prior to that by Joseph Robidoux and others. The town has a large number of museums dedicated to a lot of different things, and we're going to highlight two of those places in particular today. And we're going to start by with our first guest from the Pony Express Museum. Beth, could you introduce yourself? Tell us, of course, your own name and exactly what your role is with the museum.
Okay, my name is Beth Whitchurch, and I am the Chief Operations Officer of the Pony Express National Museum.
Okay, which means you do everything.
Pretty much. I'm a jack of all trades. That's definitely true.
Great. Well, can you tell us a little bit about, we want to, I try to connect things together for folks, and obviously we're here because of Lewis and Clark, and as we move through this, we try to weave different things together. Obviously, the river was a conduit of information. We're in an area where a lot of the trails west begin, or at least continued on, diverge from here. We were in Lexington, Missouri just a couple of weeks ago, and we learned about some fellas there who actually started the Pony Express Company. It's interesting, as we move west, the relationship we see between these communities and that sort of thing. Tell us a little bit about those individuals who started the company, who we introduced to our viewers when we were in Lexington, and then how they came here, how the Pony Express evolved, and just share with us some of those things. We'll take a look at the B-roll in a little while, but why don't you start first with giving us some background on Pony Express?
The Pony Express began here on April 3rd, 1860. It was founded by three gentlemen, William Russell, William Waddell, and Alexander Majors. They operated the Southern Oxbow route, the stagecoach route, but they were approached by the senator out in California once people started traveling out to California during the gold rush. They were approached by the senator. His name was Senator Gwynn, and he asked them if they could come up with a quick, fast, efficient way to get mail from the eastern side of the United States all the way out to California, because there were lots of important things going on during that time frame, and the people out in California wanted to know what was happening. So the three men who had started establishing the central route believed it could work. And when the senator enticed them with $1 million government contract, they of course took on the challenge. They had 90 days under this contract to establish the route, to build the stations, to hire all the riders that they needed, and they completed that in 90 days, but they still had to prove their worthiness. And after that fact, they would be awarded the $1 million. So that's actually how it began.
Okay, and right here we are right where that began.
Exactly.
And we're essentially at stop number one, or
exactly.
Right.
Up the street from us is the Patey House Hotel, which was the founding offices of the three founders, and that was actually to be where the first rider left from. The first rider's name was Johnny Fry, and he was to leave during the afternoon of April 3rd, 1860. But the mail coming into St. Joseph was running late that day. Can't believe it, but it was happening.
How did it arrive here?
It came on the railroad, via the railroad. The crowd that had gathered was outrageous. They say people traveled from everywhere across the country to see this. It was an incredibly historic event, and people wanted to take part in it. But of course, since the mail was running late, the crowd was getting restless, and had actually started to get up close to Johnny and his horse, and were tugging at Johnny's clothes and the horse's hair, and you know how horses are when they're around lots of people. So Johnny brought his horse down here to the stables, which is what we're right in front of, which back then was called the Pikes Peak Stables, and he hid out basically inside the stables until the mail was delivered on the train.
Terrific, and the rest is history.
And the rest is history.
Well, why don't we take a look at some of the B-roll, and as we do, if you can explain to us what we're seeing,
Sure.
and also feel free to infuse into the conversation here a little bit about, I know that your website will be available for people to see
Absolutely.
connected through us, and just where you're located and those kind of things.
Okay. As we're going, you open the front door. This gentleman right here, his name's Carl Getz, and he was actually the founder of the Pony Express Museum. He purchased the property and basically saved it from complete demolition. He stabilized the front part of the building, which was actually the only part of the building that was standing during the 1950s. As you can see here, it was basically being held up by a couple of 2x4s. Stabilized the front part of the museum and turned it into a smaller museum, which consisted of a blacksmith shop and a gift shop, essentially. And then later on in the early 1990s, some more members of his family got together with citizens of the community, and they raised enough money to bring the building back to its original glory. In order to do that, they conducted a series of archaeological digs, which uncovered the original foundations of the building that were underneath all the brick and rubble that had been left. And so the building that you see today is actually the original stables. This right here you're seeing is the actual water well that was used when this was the Pony Express stables. It was uncovered by chance, actually. An archaeological dig uncovered it.
Now, this is a different pump.
Yeah, the well still exists. Yeah, the pump we've brought in, but the actual well is underneath the ground. You can view it through a window. The water table still rises and falls just like it does at the Missouri River, and kids get a chance to pump the well, kind of experience life back then. Here's some more of the artifacts that we found in the bottom of the archaeological digs. A lot of these were found in the well itself. So that's actually where we found a lot of our artifacts we have on display are during those archaeological digs. But our museum is made up of a lot of interactive activities for the kids. They can practice being horse buyers. They can sit on a mochila saddle, which was used to carry the mail across the country.
And mochila means?
Mochila means backpack in Spanish. You can transfer the saddle from one horse to another. This is Johnny Fry. You'll see in our introductory exhibit called The Moment in Time, which basically talks about that very first day. They can move saddles from one saddle to another. Riders coming into home stations and relay stations were only allotted 2 minutes to transfer the mail in order to remain on schedule. So you can kind of get the kids a chance to practice and see how fast they can transfer the saddle from one horse to another. The pockets on either side of the mochila are called cantinas, and that's where the mail was kept. 3 of them were locked and filled with mail, and 1 was left open if they needed to pick up mail along the way. Here's a cancellation stamp that was used by the Pony Express, and you can actually stamp your own piece of thin, lightweight paper that's similar to the paper that they used to write the mail on. It was very light paper in order to keep the cost down, because it did cost quite a lot to send the mail along the Pony Express route. Here's an interactive exhibit that kids can participate in. They can go in and dress up as pioneer children. They can experience life in a one-room schoolhouse, kind of get the feel of what it was like to be a child back during those days. Of course, here are the 3 founders and our interpretation of them, Russell, Majors, and Waddell. We also showcase a lot of the more famous Pony Express riders for whatever reason. You see Buffalo Bill there in the middle. He went on to create the Buffalo Bill Wild West show.
Sure.
Which is very well known. We have Charles Cliff. We showcase Billy Richardson, Johnny Fry, of course, who was the first rider of the Pony Express, which there he is. He left here from St. Joseph and went on the first leg of the trail. This is probably the most famous Pony Express image that you'll see. It's called the First Ride of the Pony Express, and it's by a gentleman named Charles Hargens. And you see in the background is the actual stables. You can see Johnny on his horse actually leaving on that very first day. This is a map that we have in the museum that outlines the particular stations along the trail. The blue dots, as you see right there in Sacramento, represents a home station, which is where the rider would start. And the red dots represent the relay stations, which is where they would transfer the mail from one horse to another. The red stations, or the relay stations, are every 10 to 15 miles, and the blue stations, or home stations, are every 80 to 100 miles on average. We're really lucky to know as much as we do about the route, because, you know, a business that only lasts 18 months, 150 years ago, we're lucky we know anything about it at all. So we're very enlightened to know that there were this many stations, and we have as much documentation on them as we do. In some of those cases, there are actually artifacts we found along the trail. This particular exhibit is a jacket that was worn during the Buffalo Bill Wild West show. It was worn by one of his actors, and that was donated to us. We also have a little exhibit that kind of shows how the Pony Express name has transcended through time. It's taken on so many different images. People have used it to advertise their businesses. We have lots of merchandise with Pony Express memorabilia on it, movies and books and all kinds of things that you'll see all over the country, and even on eBay, as a matter of fact.
Well, it is amazing for an entity that's its existence being only 18 months, that it has had such a profound impact on the American psyche and so many other parts of our world. How many men rode, or boys, I guess, largely, how many individuals were actually engaged in riding for the Pony Express?
We have record of over 200, but we know that's by no means conclusive, because there aren't a lot of records. In fact, still to this day, we have guests that come in that claim that their great-great-great-grandfather rode for the Pony Express, and if they'll give us the documentation, we'll add them to the list.
Excellent. Now, and we saw with the home stations and the relay stations, those home stations are where was the distance the rider would
the rider himself.
So 80 to 100 miles was an average
miles,
ride?
Yeah, in about 8 to 12 hours is how long it'd take them to go that.
Excellent. Well, that's tremendous. We certainly appreciate it. And, of course, as I mentioned before, your information as far as your website and all will be located on our website.
Great.
People can link through to it. And we do thank you so much for being here. And it's what a great town. We encourage people to come and see all the different museums. St. Joe is a museum-rich environment. There's a lot of history here, and the Pony Express is just a part of it. I want to thank you so much,
Thank you very
Beth.
much.
And we're gonna ask you to give way for someone from another museum here in town.
Absolutely.
One and even more curious museum, I might add.
Very much. Thank you very
Thank you, Beth. We're going to be joined now by a gentleman from the Glore Psychiatric Museum. Now, this is a new one, folks. Now, we're going to find a way, and there is a way here, in fact, for us we're going to connect to Lewis and Clark as we talk about the Glore Psychiatric Museum. And, however, this is going to be an unusual one for you. So if you're at all curious about the American psychiatric legacy, you're going to see some very interesting artifacts and find out some information here that'll prove curious to you, I'm sure. And I'm going to ask our guest to do the same as our previous guest. If you would introduce yourself and tell our viewers what it is you do for the museum.
I'm Scott Clark, and I'm the curator of the Glore Museum, and I do just about the same things that Beth does. We just do it all, it seems like.
Great. Well, I have to ask you, before we actually start looking at the footage of the museum itself, what was the impetus for any psychiatric museum, first of all, but in particular one here in St. Joe?
Our museum was founded by George Glore in 1968. That's where the name came from. He had a series of replicas built for treatment devices and had them made for a Mental Health Awareness Week. And they went over so well that when he brought them back out to the hospital, the superintendent suggested he see what else he could find. St. Joseph was, as you had mentioned before, was one of the stopping off places, the jumping off places for all the trails. We had a lot of folks coming through town 130 some years ago. So the state hospital was kind of a natural addition to the town here.
So they were either crazy for coming west or they came back from the west crazy, huh?
We had people dropped off here. Family members were dropped off here when the rest of the clan went west.
Now, we don't want to be flip about this because psychiatric health is a very serious issue, and we don't want to make light of it, but it is a curious phenomena, and and it's actually probably in many ways sort of a dark chapter in American history, and perhaps the things like this museum are a good way to at least open in this conversation so that people do understand the serious nature of psychiatric health in America.
Well, and that's our whole message. What they're seeing in our museum, we don't do now. Yes, thank goodness. And brain science, psychiatric science has changed so much just in the last few years. Probably some of the modern things that George was documenting as we built the museum are now kind of outdated. It's amazing we have nurses come through and say, I used to use some of those stuff. Right. And that's a scary part. But we also try and reduce the stigma that's associated with this. We want people to get help. If they have a friend who has a problem, tell somebody about it. Get them some help. Because the stuff they're seeing we don't do now, and treatment does work.
And this isn't just about psychiatric health either. It's about the whole field of medical treatment generally. I mean, we certainly have many times on our broadcast talked about how medicine has changed. I mean, we don't we don't use leeches anymore. So physical medicine has changed as well as as well as the medical or the psychiatric aspects of it. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the footage, and if you would just explain to our viewers what it is we're seeing.
We'll also talk about the leech therapy because, yes, there's a lot of hospitals going back to it now, believe it or not. This is our historic building, the 1874 building. It was designed to be kind of the big, massive red brick building. I thought that would be kind of the stabilizing factor, the grounding our patients would need. After an 1879 fire, it was rebuilt to look like the previous shot, and this is what we looked just before we moved. We, about 7 years ago, moved into a brand new facility. We talk about fears, phobias, and anxiety disorders. We want people to realize that there's 350 recognized fears, but that they're the easiest to treat because it's something that you've learned. And if you have a fear of elevators or spiders or snakes or whatever it might be, it's something that you've learned. It's something we can get you through. This is an exhibit about a woman who had an obsessive compulsive disorder, who liked to swallow a lot of things. So when the doctors finally operated on her, they found 1,446 things in her. We're talking salt shaker lids and nuts and buttons and safety pins and carpet tacks, just a lot of things. And unfortunately, she died during this operation. It's one of the exhibits that we've gotten a lot of play from, like Ripley's and the other people who have been through here. Phrenology, there were a couple Austrian doctors who theorized that they could predict behavior and personality by measuring your scalp and comparing it to a known scale, the bust. Not much science there, but it had a lot of play for a long time. There's still some doctors now that will say that by the shape of your head they can tell how you're going to act. Electroconvulsive therapy, we quit doing that about 30 years ago, but again, there's a lot of hospitals going back to it. They seem to think that they get pretty good results for depression and things like that. So again, we talk about how times have changed.
Let's stop here for just a moment. And if you would, because I imagine a lot of our viewers, particularly younger viewers, we just passed right over there and talked about electroshock therapy. Why don't you explain exactly how this worked?
And that's the problem. They really don't know what they did when they were doing it.
Well, I'm talking about physically what's happening here.
The process was they would put the two pads on either side of the patient's head. They'd send a very brief electrical charge through the skull. The patient was usually knocked out. Now, 40 years ago, there was a lot of convulsions, a lot of the seizures that would be introduced because of that, because somebody had theorized at one time that epileptics were never schizophrenic, and that meant probably that the seizures were keeping them from being ill. So the theory was if they could artificially induce the convulsions, then the person would get well. Not much science. I guess it was a good way to approach it, but it isn't how it worked. Nowadays, when they do it, there's a lot of anesthesia, so the patient is out before they do this, muscle relaxants, so they don't have to suffer the convulsions and things like that. And they still don't know what it does or what it does not do.
Right. Seems very strange for us to even imagine that happening. Let's go ahead and continue with the footage here.
We're
going to go to this other. There we go.
We had a lot of various other treatments. We used the camisoles, were basically an early form of straitjacket or restraint. We used the mattress covers to make those because it was a thicker material, wouldn't rip. We've got a lot of that. Of course, again, a lot of this stuff we don't do now. George Glow tells about how he used to walk out in the ward twice a day and hose everyone down with the idea that would calm them down. Well, we don't do that now. Lobotomies were developed in the 60s, continued to about 72. We quit doing those in 62 because we found they just weren't doing what we thought they'd do. And that's where they would actually drill holes in the head to remove part of the brain. But again, we don't do that now. And while we think it's barbaric, the guys that developed it got the Nobel Prize for it. Trephination, again, this is an ancient treatment. They thought they could punch holes in the skull and let all the demons out and stuff like that. Well, what's fascinating is a lot of the people 3,000 years ago, they're finding skulls that have had this done to it. But in many cases, the person lived after they did this, that the hole was actually able to heal. And then our connection to the Lewis and Clark is through Dr. Rush. Benjamin Rush is considered the father of American psychiatric care because he started looking at why people acted like they did, not just trying to treat the symptoms they present. Rush was the medical advisor. Lewis spent quite a bit of time there and was trying to learn how to treat the things. And some of the ideas that Rush proposed were kind of strange, like he'd strap people into this chair, you'd be strapped in there for as much as 6 months where they could pour fluids over your head or bleed you or leech you or put your feet in ice packs. They thought if the straps were really secure that you relax and your pulse would calm. Well, there's not much science to that. But this is from the guy that was considered to be one of the leading doctors of his time.
A man who we've talked before is caught between the world of the four bodily humors and scientific observation.
Yes. It's amazing to me, and I've read the book, and some of the observations are just really neat for somebody 200 years ago to even have thought about this stuff. And we look at stuff being barbaric now, but it was probably in better shape back then. Again, we bleed folks. These are some of our exhibit there.
In fact, it's curious, the expedition was actually doing bleeding right here in this area. The men were suffering from they were sweating a great deal, and Lewis was actually doing some bleeding of the men here.
Well, you know that George Washington had this bronchitis and a sore throat, and his doctors ordered he be bled every half hour for 3 weeks. No wonder the guy died.
Right. There's a lot of speculation that the bleeding was the cause. Although, and you alluded to it a moment ago, that bleeding, there may be some value, and certain people still adhere to the idea that there is some value to the letting of blood and all. But it's amazing, and we talked about this before, whether, there are parts of the medical practice that is still art and not necessarily science, even today.
Well, that's why they call it a practice, because they're not real sure on some of it. They're still trying to learn.
Right. Well, listen, thank you so much, Scott. I want to turn our attention now to our viewing audience for just a moment and give them the opportunity to ask some questions. And Beth is still here from the Pony Express Museum as well. And if we do have questions out there, we'll take a couple of real quickly, and we're going to do that. In just a moment, we're going to take some very special. We're going to have a chance to take a look at some very special footage this week. All of you know, and we talk about Jim Sturm, and you've seen him a few times. Generally, while we're doing our work out here, Jim is behind the scenes doing his work, and you rarely get to see him. And sometimes people, I think, believe that he is the long-suffering technical director of this operation. And while we're out here reveling in the experience of riding up the river on boats and getting to have these wonderful experiences, that Jim is just nose to the grindstone and having to endure all the tedium that's associated with the weekly production of these broadcasts and that sort of thing. But we're going to end here today real quickly. I think we do have some email questions, but we're going to take one of those very quickly. Do you have one for me, Josh? Go ahead and ask the question. Just go ahead and give it here. Here we go. We'll take that very quickly. One of the questions was, what happened to the founders after the end of the Pony Express, and was it a financial failure? Actually, if we can just go here. Okay, very good. Beth, we'll have you back in here very quickly. Thanks. And thank you again, Scott. What happened to the founders?
There are several different stories about what happened to the founders. Essentially, the business itself went bankrupt. And so the founders went on. One was actually not too far from here and in financial ruin, completely just destroyed.
Was the Pony Express the cause of their ruination?
Yes, absolutely. The Pony Express did not support itself. The business went bankrupt. The cost of mail was too much. The costs across the trail were just outrageous. And in the end, they were not given the $1 million government contract to pay for their business. So the entire business went bankrupt, and that's really why the Pony Express ended.
And of course, the Transcontinental Railroad was shortly followed there.
Right. And the telegraph was completed from coast to coast, so that eliminated the need for the relay service.
Well, it's certainly a great chapter in American history. And speaking of American history, we're going to be coming to you again next week as we move further up the trail. By next week, we will have moved into Nebraska, and we are at the edge of Missouri. We have had a tremendous time in Missouri. This is our last city in Missouri. We will be in Missouri for a few days yet, and we're going to have an opportunity to spend a little more time on this side of the river. But the other side of the river from here is Kansas. It's about to be Nebraska, and in just a couple of days we'll be crossing out of the great state of Missouri, which has played host to us since the 14th of May. And to all the folks in Missouri, the Water Patrol, the Department of Conservation, the Governor's Office, all of the state agencies that have made this trip through Missouri possible, we want to thank all of you and all of the good folks of Missouri along the way who have been so hospitable to us as we've made our trek this far. And we look forward to next year when the keel boat hopefully will be coming back through this area, having an opportunity to revisit these communities, and certainly in 06 as we conclude our expedition. We're going to answer any other questions that we have from our online audience via email. We'll be responding to them via email. And right now we're going to go to our closing segment, which is some footage. And I mentioned this earlier about Mr. Sturm being the long-suffering technical director of this operation. The footage you're about to see was taken from an airplane as the boats make their way from St. Joe up to Nottoway Island. And ladies and gentlemen, I assure you, the gentleman taking the photographs was Jim Sturm, and he enjoyed every minute of it. Until we see you again next week, thanks for joining us for Live with Lewis. We proceed on.